I think you can't deny the history of Singapore music, especially in the 90s, when a lot of indie bands were on radio regularly, on TV, in the newspapers, and it was basically they were in the mainstream media, a lot of time. So to deny that is just trying to rewrite history.
Again, to ignore bands like the Oddfellows that played a huge part, bands like Comeback, Concave Scream, that had huge hits on radio, and that, a whole generation of fans grew up listening, and a lot of people who are inspired a lot of people in bands, myself, many others. I think that's a bit of a travesty. And I think it's patently unfair, because if you're talking about pop music, pop culture, yes, these bands had a major input, had a major role. Just trying so hard now.
So what? I think you cannot generalize the whole scene as what they want as term as success. I think each individual band or artist has their own definition on success. So, for example, some bands, they want to go overseas and perform, or maybe they want to be heard on radio, or some bands want to play bay beats, and they see that as their, epitome of success, whatever, So you can't generalize the whole scene as, okay, commercial. If you have made it commercially, that's successful. That I don't think you can define success that way.
But surely commercialism and being commercially viable is a factor in the longevity of any industry and any genre.
Yeah, for sure.
So, I mean, I think, if you ask any indie supporter, they'd be up in arms about this issue. But if you ask anyone outside of the indie scene, they would be like, why won't they just come out and work with the big boys and release something? So, how would you react to someone who says that?
I don't really quite understand where that's coming from, because especially during the 90s, in those days we worked with everyone. So we did corporate events if there were corporate events. We did shows with national radio, and there was no kind of restriction or limits to what we could do, just because we're so-called indie. We just want to get our music out there. Any artist, singer, songwriter really just wants to be heard by the most people, right? If you don't want to, then you might as well just stay in your bedroom and just play to yourself. So to me, it's that whole argument is a non-starter.
I think one of the barometers of whether something is successful is always album sales, and it is never a good indication in Singapore, though. Singapore seems to be the anomaly. Even if you're talking about your so-called really big artists in Singapore, your Dick Lees, your Taufiks, how many albums do they sell? Sometimes we see the papers and we see 20,000, 30,000. That's nothing. That is nothing. I'm sorry to say, independent bands in the States sell those amount of albums on their first week of release, right? So it's just the nature here, and people don't buy records. Electrical, the band that was in last time, was supposed to be one of the most successful bands. Yeah, we had #1 songs on radio, did a lot of shows, did a lot of corporate events, kids loved it, etc. Album sales, 3,000 to 4,000 tops, and it's just the way it is. People don't buy records very much. Your big bands, your Foo Fighters, they probably sell about maybe 10,000, around that range, 10, 15,000. People just don't, Singapore is not a culture where people buy albums. Again, it comes down to success, right? What is your view of success? If your view of success is to get a mention in Big O, which mine originally was when I started my band, it's like, oh my God, yeah, I want to be in Big O.
Congratulations,
that happened. Okay, I can quit now, right? Or if your motivation is to tour the States and play sold out shows, have a Billboard charting album, then nobody has done it here. And I think that's why people just who look too much to the West to feel for validation and a sense that your accomplishment must be measured against output there. They see nothing coming out from here, so they go, well, it's second tier, it's second rate. Maybe it is, but it doesn't mean that we don't have.
What do you feel the indie scene right now is at? Is it better or is it worse off than in the 90s when radio was playing?
There have been a lot of factors pushing up local music in the last few years. More venues, more shows by the Esplanade. So there are more venues now for local bands to play. than before. But again, you know, it's critical mass. You need the support. You need people to actually go to your shows, right? It's no point having hundreds of venues when each one only has 20 people each time a band plays. So it's really, we got to sit down and think about why this is happening, what's going wrong, and what we can do. Even if it's, you know, something that each of us can play a small part in, we should do that.
Yeah, I mean, I remember the 90s where, you know, people would just gather at the substation garden and watch a gig, or World Trade Center as well, and you know, there's so many more venues now, but I think maybe there's just too much distraction. You know, there's so many activities happening. There's so many gigs happening almost every night. Not just gigs. Yeah, Facebook. So, you know, maybe all that kind of add up, you know. Yeah. And then about radio also, I think in the early 90s, DJs could play what they like, you know. And then when they started programming the playlist and all that, I think that kind of restricted the DJs in what they could play. You know, they had to follow a very strict playlist. So I think all that kind of hampered the growth.
And I think, I mean, when I was a kid, you know, when Patrick's band, The Oddfellows, when I first heard them, I was pretty blown away, because I was like, wow, this is unlike anything I've ever heard on radio or anything else. And the song was big, and if it wasn't for radio, I probably wouldn't have heard of them. You know, you hear it a little bit on radio, and then you're like, where do I check this up? Then you read Big O Magazine, and it's like, oh, here these guys are. And then, you know, it's like a little bit more and more, then you start delving deep. So radio is part of pop culture, right? I mean, radio, television, and that has a very important role to play in highlighting and letting people discover music.
Name me a local musician or a band or a song that changed your life.
Okay, one of the albums that kind of changed my life was Nothing on the Radio. The very first cassette that Big O came up with in, I believe, 1986. There was Corporate Toil in there, Razor's Edge, Chris Ho, State of Art, and a few other people. The band that really moved me and really inspired me was Corporate Toil, and the two songs on it. I mean, prior to that, the only local music I heard was Zircon Lounge, of course the Class X albums, and some of the pop stuff, you know, Digley, Mark Chan and all that. So when I heard Nothing on the Radio, it was really nothing like I've heard before from local artists. And it was innovative, it was exciting, there was a spirit to it, you know, that really moved me. Yeah. And at that time I was already starting to write my own songs, and that really inspired me further.
Yeah, actually for me, it's probably a combination of two persons. It's this guy here, and Chris Ho. So it was actually, because I just give some context, I'm kind of like in between a little bit. Like I was in my 20s and the 80s, and that's the worst time to be in local music. In the early 90s, I was really in my 30s, right? So I already had 2 kids, married and everything. So it was more or less like, it's over kind of thing, forget about your musical dream or whatever kind of thing, you know? Until I opened in Straight Science Live and came across this picture of these 3 guys, including our friend here. And there was a column by Chris Ho, Pop Live, and it's really talking about a mile, the cassette, right? And it's like, my eyes really like opened wide. It's like, wow, you know, there's something happening in Singapore, finally, right? And that really, really changed my life, because that was like, whoa, I can actually, my dream is not over, you know, right? And I think a lot of people now cannot appreciate what it was like back then. It was really something so new for us here in Singapore. After years, I mean, almost 2 decades of not having any, you know, of our own bands, any of our own really original music, it's something that was so different, it's so exciting that we cannot, I think it's really hard to describe to people now what it was like back then. It was really something that was our own. So yeah, so thank you, Pat.
I guess for me it was the same thing, you know, discovering The Oddfellows through like Big O's first New School Rock with Corporate Toil as well. Was it Corporate Toil or C135? It was Corporate Toil, right? Yeah, that was the first one. Yeah, and OP of course. And you know, it was just like the most ridiculous, raw sounding, in your face song, and you know, a song about Caroline being an asshole. I was like, whoa, that takes guts.
Whoa,
You know, even
anything
now, you
like
wouldn't.
that.
Not many bands would release a song like that, right? And you know, this is back. You know, and it blew my little mind. You know, and then at the same time, around the same time, I remember hearing Days' "Sexy Little Boy," and I was like, this is awesome. You know, this electro pop with guitars with this exaggerated, affected voice, and it just sounded so good. But I think the highlight of all of that was about a year or two later when Viggo released New School Rock 2. You know, where he had that CD compilation of about like 18 songs, and that was really, you know, to me a high watermark, and because you had this whole variety of artists from as diverse as No Names, Global Chaos, Iza, you know, all coming out and putting their songs on an album, and it was a fantastic album. It sounded great. I just kept playing it over and over, and you know, it's just loved it so much. And you know, it's I think probably these three, you know, these three releases would have probably been, you know, the things that really instilled in me this need to want to make my music and make a stand and release music and contribute as well.